In the picturesque neighborhood of Marais in Paris lies the Building 17, Rue Beautreillis. In 2021, a sign emerged above the door that read, "Jim Morrison did not die here." The police report will tell you that this was where he died of heart failure, but clearly not everyone thinks this was the case. Jim Morrison left the earth on July 3rd, 1971, but half a century later, the mystery of what happened that night hasn't gone away. On March 1st, 1969, the Doors were playing at the Dinner Key Auditorium in Miami, a concert that has become something of myth and legend, but for all the wrong reasons. Jim Morrison was seen as one of the figureheads of the hippie movement across the USA and emerged in front of his adoring fans on the East Coast. Bizarrely enough, he was holding a literal lamb in his hand. Much has been said about this fabled gig, but a person who was at this concert spoke to Miami New Times about what had happened. Morrison stepped, or rather staggered, onto the stage like a good shepherd with a white lamb in his arms and a half-finished whiskey bottle in his hand. He put the bottle on the amp, held onto the lamb, and grabbed the microphone. Finally, a song. But instead, all he did was rant against the system and how the man was oppressing us. Then there was something about screwing our teachers and rebelling against our parents, two of whom had driven us in their station wagon and were watching from the back of the auditorium. Hey, what happened to the song? We wondered. Then the band broke into another endless riff. Morrison did something we couldn't see, and suddenly the man appeared in blue uniforms and whisked them off. I remember the amp swaying as the crowd rushed the stage, and then the band split. Last thing we saw was Morrison standing on the balcony shirtless in his black leather pants with his white lamb and a couple of chicks. It was the worst concert we ever saw. What this audience member didn't see was an act of indecent exposure. Perhaps it was a statement about fame, perhaps it was from taking too much drugs. But Jim Morrison had taken all of his clothes off in front of his audience and was arrested. And this incident set the wheels in motion for a highly disturbing sequence of events. Morrison was sentenced to 6 months in prison for this crime, and the system that he was railing against seemed to have finally caught up with him. However, he planned to appeal this verdict and in the meantime got out of jail on a $50,000 bond. Jim spent this time out of jail recording the Doors' iconic album LA Woman and continued to perform some incredibly chaotic concerts. Eventually, he traveled to Paris to seek an escape from the highly turbulent life that he had. Here, Jim Morrison and his girl, Pamela Corson, lived in the house mentioned at the start of this video. Jim and Pamela both used these occasions to clean up their lives. Morrison immersed himself in Parisian culture and became good friends with the French director Jacques Demy and his wife and photographer Agnès Varda. Morrison was also friends with the French photographer Alain Rounet. Unlike many of the hanger-ons Morrison had while in LA, in Paris he had friendships here that he felt were genuine. According to Varda, "I think he liked us because we never asked him for anything." On July 3rd, 1971, Morrison enjoyed a pleasant evening in Paris where he and Pamela went to see a movie, had dinner, and then spent the rest of the night listening to records. However, in the middle of the night, Jim told Pamela that he felt sick. She ran a bath for him and he went inside. She later woke up at dawn to find that Jim was not by her side, and to her shock and horror, Jim was still in the bath and unresponsive. Emergency services were called. They arrived, but sadly, they were unable to revive him. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The official reason for his death is that he suffered heart failure. At 5:40 p.m., Pamela gave a police report describing the events. She said, "About 3:30 a.m., I think, there isn't a clock in the bedroom. My friend wakes me up with the noise of his breathing. He was so noisy I got the impression he must need help. I wanted to help my friend. I asked him, did he want a doctor? No. He said he was okay, and he was going to take a hot bath. He got in the bath and then he called me because he felt sick. I took him in an orange saucepan, and my friend threw up the meal he'd eaten and I'd noticed some blood clots." According to Pamela, Jim did not feel ill enough to call a doctor. "I thought he seemed better because he'd been sick and his color had returned, so I went back to bed feeling reassured. I don't know when I went back to sleep, but I woke up later and realized my friend wasn't in bed with me. I ran to the bathroom and saw he was still in the bath with his head back as if asleep. He had blood around his nostrils. I thought he must be ill or he's unconscious. I tried to pull him out of the bath, but it was impossible for me. At that point, I called Mr. Rounet and he came with Mrs. Agnès Demy, aka Varda, and they called the police station for me." However, as more information unfolded, there were several holes in Pamela's accounts of what happened, and the aftermath of his death added to the suspicion. As far as the police were concerned, Pamela's account was what happened and there was no autopsy or investigation. Rather than take his body to the morgue, Jim was kept inside a coffin at his home, which is a tradition in France, and rather strangely, Jim was buried in Paris. When Jim stayed in the French capital, he enjoyed walking through a famous cemetery known as Père Lachaise, which contained the headstones of writers such as Marcel Proust, Oscar Wilde, and Gertrude Stein. Jim saw himself above everything as a poet, and told one interviewer that it was poetry and not music that was the ultimate art form. And Jim would join these other famous writers in the cemetery. It's disputed whether this was the idea of Alain Ronay or the Doors manager, Bill Sidden. According to Ronay, Jim could rest in peace here. Pam wanted Jim buried in LA for God's sake. What? And have bus tours stopping every 2 hours? On the day of the funeral, none of the other members of the Doors were at it. Despite being adored by millions everywhere, only 5 people were at his funeral. These were Agnes Varda, Alain Ronay, Pamela Courson, Bill Siddons, and Morrison's Parisian secretary, Robin Werdle. While traveling from LA to Paris for a funeral might be a big ask for some people outside of his immediate circle, Jim's parents were not in attendance. It's alleged that Pamela lied to the US Embassy that he had no immediate family members. Jim also had a fractured relationship with his family and was known for telling people that his parents were dead while they were very much alive. When Jim had written a will 2 years before his death, all of his estate went to Pamela. According to Sidden, a quiet funeral is what Jim would have wanted. I wanted the funeral low-key. I saw what happened with Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. Jim was buried with the respect and consideration he deserved as a great poet and artist. I don't know about the theories surrounding Jim's death. All I know is Pam told me he died of a heart attack. She simply said, "I went to check on him, and he was no longer with us." However, it seemed like an open secret that this account given by Pamela was, at the very least, not telling the full story. The obvious hole in this theory is that 27-year-olds do not just simply die of heart failure, and Jim had a well-documented drug addiction. Morrison embodied the live fast and die young approach to life and had clearly suffered the consequences. While getting out of LA seemed like a wise idea for Morrison, staying in Paris was not the best place to live a clean life either. On the week that Morrison died, Newsweek produced a story called The Heroin Plague, with Paris highlighted as a particularly notorious area for this drug. Jim was against harder drugs like heroin, but it's believed that he tried it for the first time here in Paris. Danny Sugerman, an author of the book about the Doors and personally knew the band, said, "It's not unusual when someone does heroin for the first time for them to feel ill. He was sick, he took a bath, he died. There was no more mystery than that." Pamela would eventually confess that it was a drug-related death, but gave numerous accounts of what happened. According to Jordan Runtoff from People magazine, in some versions she told friends he began using heroin during their stay in Paris as a way to cement their relationship. In others, he died the first night he tried it. In the most chilling retelling, the needle-phobic Morrison snorted Courson's heroin by mistake, believing it to be cocaine. Other times, Courson would deny that heroin played any role in Morrison's death whatsoever. Pamela would return back to LA a broken woman, and 3 years after this incident, she died of a heroin overdose. She was also just 27 years of age. With Pamela deceased, an important witness to what happened was no longer with us. It wasn't until 2007 that someone else who saw Jim during his final hours decided to speak out and claimed that, just like the sign seen above the house in 2021, Jim Morrison did not die in his Parisian home. He was somewhere else. Towards his latter days, Morrison was a regular at a nightclub called the Rock and Roll Circus. This was managed by a fellow American named Sam Barnett, and when Jim was around, it was also frequented by celebrities like Hollywood director Roman Polanski and the actress Marianne Faithfull. On July 3rd, the very night that Jim was supposedly in his apartment listening to records, Jim was actually seen in this nightclub. At 1 a.m., Jim was spotted with 2 other men, both of whom Burnett claimed were drug dealers. At one point, people started complaining that one of the bathroom cubicles had been locked for a very long time, and someone should check on it. Burnett got a bouncer to break down the cubicle doors in the bathroom. Inside this cubicle was an unresponsive Jim Morrison. A customer of the nightclub happened to be a doctor and examined him. He noticed blood on his nose and believed that this was through snorting heroin. Morrison was famously scared of needles. When spotting an unresponsive Morrison, the other men he was with spoke to Burnett. The doctor said he was dead, but the 2 men disagreed. "He's not dead, he's just effed up," they said. "Don't call the police, don't call his family, we take him home, we know where he lives." I said, "That's impossible, we have to call the police and the medical people." "No," they said. "Forget it, we'll take him and we'll use the back door." Then the club owner's right-hand man appears and confirms, "No trouble, no police, we don't want any scandal, they'll close us down." I said, "You can't do that." "No, I'm the boss, you do what I say." As far as I can tell, they may have placed him in the bathtub of his home in order to give him a cold bath to wake him up and shock him back into consciousness. Whatever the case, this is where he was found by the paramedics. They took him to the apartment. I was told this. They put him in the tub and waited an hour and a half before calling the paramedic. Pamela was in the apartment, out of her mind, screaming, completely stoned. This theory assumes that they managed to bring Jim back to his apartment unnoticed. According to Google Maps, this is about a 20-minute drive or slightly shorter given that there would be less traffic during the early hours of the morning. While the sequence of events looks suspicious, Sam Barnett is a former New York Times journalist and was not just some random person, and there is also someone else who backs up the sequence of events. A photographer named Patrick Chauvel was working as a part-time barman at the club and says that Jim Morrison regularly visited the spot. I saw Jim Morrison many times at the club. He was rarely on his own. He'd come in and sit on a couch separate to the other clientele. He didn't dance or make a big noise. I remember him coming in once 3 nights in a row. He came often, and there were times when I didn't see him, but it was a big club on 2 floors, full of French stars. He wasn't the only big star in the club, and on the night in question he said, Jean-Marie Rivière, l'Alcazar boss and king of the Parisian music halls and nightclub music scene got involved. He spoke to several guys including me and said, "We've got a problem here." They called in a doctor and asked us to stay around, and to make the story shorter, we had to take him out of there because if they find Jim Morrison dead in the club, that's the end of the club. And he admitted that he had taken the body and moved it. Yes, I helped carrying him in a blanket. I can't say 100% that he was dead, but he wasn't moving, that's for sure. Yeah, I thought this is bizarre, but I just come back from Vietnam. I'd seen a lot of weird things. Anyhow, he was then put into the backseat of a Mercedes. I don't know who drove the car. They took him home is what they told me. They wanted everything to look as normal as possible. I remember they put him into the backseat very gently, and that's why I thought he might still be alive. I saw that shape, that heavy shape. As well as backing up Sam Barnett's claim, he also backed up Danny Sugerman's claim that he had taken a drug that he was not used to and was part of the plague that was haunting Europe. According to Chauvel, so Morrison got involved with a new guy that night and the heroin wasn't the same at all. It was a lot more pure and Jim didn't know that, and he overdosed. Over the years, many theories emerged that Jim Morrison was murdered. However, these theories rely on circumstantial evidence rather than anything tangible. The CIA were seen as the culprits because of Jim Morrison's almost messiah-like influence on young people, and the fact that Jim Morrison's father was a high-profile Navy officer also added further fuel to these theories. It's hard to find any credible evidence linking them to his death. There's also theories that Jim faked his own death and is still alive. In 2005, a man named Gerald Pitts claimed that Jim Morrison was still alive and living on a ranch in Oregon. He's also made a movie starring the 61-year-old Jim Morrison that you conveniently have to pay $25 to watch. Many people have claimed to have seen Jim Morrison based on them coming across people who have a resemblance to him. However, none of them have been brave enough to pluck a hair off these potential Jim Morrisons and do a DNA test. And another mystery is a photo taken at Jim Morrison's grave where the rock historian Brett Messner is pictured next to what looks to be the ghost of Jim Morrison in the background. But in 2014, someone came forward to not only bring new information about Jim's death, but alleged it was her boyfriend that killed Jim Morrison. When Morrison and Pamela moved to Paris, they did not go together on the same flight. Jim arrived in Paris a few weeks after her, and it's alleged that Pamela was moving to Paris whether he joined her or not. Pamela knew a notorious drug dealer living in Paris named Jean-Dean Boutet, and both Jim and Jean previously competed for her attention when he lived in LA in the late 1960s. In The Doors' 1968 song Love Street, Morrison is said to be referencing Jean with the lyrics, "She has robes and she has junkies, lazy diamond-studded flunkies." But when they arrived in Paris, Jean was dating an actress named Marianne Faithfull, who previously went out with Mick Jagger. In 2014, Marianne Faithfull gave an interview with Mojo magazine stating that Jean was Jim's killer. On that fateful night, De Broutet visited Morrison's apartment to sell him heroin. Marianne, out of some strange instinct, didn't go with him. I could intuitively feel trouble, I thought. I'll take a few Tunal or Bichurts, and I won't be there. Then Marianne got everything off her chest. He went to see Jim Morrison and killed him. I mean, I'm sure it was an accident, poor bastard. The smack was too strong. Yeah, and he died. And I didn't know anything about this. Anyway, everybody connected to the death of this poor guy is dead now, except me. So according to Marianne, it was not a deliberate killing, but he was selling a highly dangerous brand of heroin. According to her autobiography, we were staying at l'hotel. Suddenly, Jean had to leave. He slammed out the room. He didn't come right back. He returned in the early hours very agitated. I was effed up on Twinals. For no reason, he beat me up. I asked him, "Did you have a good time there?" He replied, "Get packed, we're going to Morocco." In the city of Tangier in Morocco, Jean de Boutet would die a year later after Jim. Jean saw himself as a dealer to the stars. Now he was a small-time heroin dealer in big trouble. He was very young. Had he lived, he might have turned into a human being. Marianne Faithfull and Sam Barnett's theories both paint a picture of a person whose downfall was almost inevitable, and 27 years old was no time to die. When Jim Morrison got in the recording studio for the final Doors album, he sang their iconic song, riders of the storm, and its immortal line, riders on the storm, into this world we're born, into this world we're thrown.